Why is racism a bad thing? Because it's creating in-groups and out-groups within the human species based on arbitrary lines, and because everyone's life should have value. And many of the progressives understand that. But then they draw their own lines in different places. So a baby before it's born doesn't have any value, many of them would say. And even after it's born now, after birth abortion is becoming a big thing in some circles and such. And so it becomes just arbitrary where you draw the line. So in my view, I think we need to get back to a view where all human lives have value.
Welcome to the Lucas Skrobot Show. I'm Lucas Skrobot, and this is where we uncover purpose, pursue truth, and own the future. Today, we are joined by Dr. Richard Weikart, who is a professor of modern European history at the California State University, Stanislaus, and a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture. He has published 5 books, including Darwin to Hitler, Evolutionary Ethics, Eugenics, Racism in Germany, Hitler's Religion, and The Death of Humanity and the Case for Life. Dr. Weikart, thank you so much for being with us here on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Now, I just finished up a series on totalitarian cults, totalitarian states, and it doesn't matter the size of the group to make a totalitarian kind of ideology play out. And as I was going through this, I noticed that most of these totalitarian states and totalitarian ideologies consistently attack the family unit. And so as I was doing my research from Mao to Stalin to small groups in the States, I saw this theme reappearing, and that is when I found your article titled Marx, Engels, and the Abolition of the Family. Now, I read this article through, and you had already been on my short list, and I got to the end of the article, and I saw your name, and I was like, that's it. I need to reach out. I need to have you on my show. So I'm just so grateful that you are here today.
Yeah, and interesting, one of the things that got me motivated to write that particular article was as I was doing my PhD work in modern European intellectual history, I noticed that a lot of the thinkers that were being feted and celebrated as the great thinkers of Western culture in the 19th and 20th centuries especially had not only were trying to undermine the family, which they were, and that's what the article is about Marx and Engels in particular, in their views on the family. And it's not just Marx and Engels, too. There's a lot of other socialist thinkers in the 19th century, Robert Owen and others. But I noticed that there was this broader theme of hatred for authority, any kind of authority structure. So hatred toward God, hatred toward the family is part of that, sort of more generic, hatred and wanting to undermine any kind of authority structure. And so the father, a figure in the family, or the husband and wife as being authority, there's anything that smacked of authority they wanted to undermine.
Now, why is that? Why are totalitarian states even they want authority, they want control? So why is it that they're trying to undermine? I mean, I think I can know why. It's a little bit of a leading question, but what is it in those sort of ideologies that is so opposed to other forms of leadership or security for individuals?
Well, you're right that they end up establishing very often more oppressive regimes than the ones they overthrow. And certainly we've seen that in the case of communist regimes in the 20th century with not only police states, concentration camps, and such. So they end up establishing these more oppressive regimes than what they start with. But interestingly, their rhetoric and the way they win over a lot of their people to their cause is by promoting freedom. And if you read Karl Marx's writings, for example, one of the main themes of it is emancipation, freedom, liberation from the oppression of the capitalist system and such. And so they're promising freedom And Marx, even though Marx rejected a lot of the anarchists of his day, like Kropotkin and others, whom he thought were misguided and naive, Marx did think, and Engels actually uses the term, that the state was going to wither away. That was his kind of conception. He thought that these authority structures would vanish once he got rid of private property. He blamed everything on private property, of course. Now, different totalitarian systems blame different things. Marx was blaming private property. Once you got rid of private property, he thought the state would vanish ultimately, because he thought that's the only reason that there was authority, was to prop up the capitalist system.
Now, to help me out here, and I think I know the answer, but there seems to be two very close cousins. One is communism, and one would be socialism. And so, from my understanding, that communism is really the mechanism that brings about socialism when the group doesn't want the idea of socialism. Is that correct?
I think that makes sense. Communism is a form of socialism, and it's a way to try to bring about socialism. And communism is usually considered the Marxist form of socialism, since Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto and used that term communism for his particular system. Socialism sometimes refers to not only to Marxist forms of government, but also to economies, but also to anarchism, to democratic socialism, other kinds of socialist ways of trying to, or different ways of trying to achieve socialism.
So then, how would you define the difference between, in today's age, you look at communist China or other communist states, but then you also look at Venezuela, where it's more socialism, and you're looking at what's happening in America, where 70% of millennials are pro-socialism. And so in my mind, I always kind of equate them to be very similar. So how would you differentiate the outplay of, communism versus socialism, or is it kind of like two shades of the same gray?
Well, the problem is that, as far as I can tell and can think of it, there's really has never been a fully socialist system that's ever been implemented, except by the communists. So it's kind of difficult to know if it's even a possibility, if that even could happen, because it's never happened. I mean, the closest we probably come was the UK in the post-World War II period, when the Labour Party, which was a fully socialist party in their goals, was elected into office, did have a majority in parliament, and began trying to implement some of their socialist policies. But 6 years later, they're voted out of office, and so then their policies get overturned by the Conservative Party, and then the Labour Party sort of went in and out of power over the next couple of decades. And by the end of the 20th century, the Labour Party was no longer fully socialist. They were more for a mixed economy and a social welfare state rather than a fully socialist economy. The Scandinavian countries are probably one of the closer countries to get into socialism too. But again, they're not socialist countries either. They're a mixed economy. And so progressives look to Scandinavia and point to it, but it's not socialist either. So we really don't have any examples of socialist countries except for ones that have done it through very oppressive means.
And this kind of goes back a little bit. I want to backtrack to a point you said, that Marx and socialism is against private property, which is one reason that they're against the family unit, because that passes down that generational wealth, that generational inheritance. And if there's no family, well, then who does the wealth belong to? It belongs to the state. But you've pointed out that places like the Nordic countries, they're not really fully socialistic, or socialism isn't fully at play there, but they're using a lot of capitalistic ideas at the same time. And I recently had Professor Dr. Stephen Hicks on the show, and he talked about that really you can look at enclaves of inner cities of America, and you can actually see socialism at play with government schooling, with government healthcare, with government paychecks, with lots of government government regulation, government housing. And so he pointed out in a previous conversation that you can actually look at the outplay and the fruit of socialistic ideologies in the inner cities of America right now. Would you agree with that assessment?
Well, there's certainly many policies that are oriented towards socialism. And in fact, interestingly, if you look at Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto and look at the 10 proposals that he gave as sort of the first 10 things that he thinks that should be done to try to move toward a socialist economy, we have some of those already in the United States. So we have certainly moved toward that direction. One of them, by the way, was a graduated income tax. That was Karl Marx's idea. And that obviously got implemented in the United States in the middle of the 20th century. So yes, we have moved toward some policies that are pushed towards socialism. But of course, again, we haven't made the full move there. And in my view, we're reaping some of the negative consequences of some of those policies too, because some of the policies you just mentioned in the inner cities of America have actually helped to perpetuate poverty rather than trying to alleviate poverty. In fact, the two key things that have done the most to alleviate poverty, or have actually studies have shown that have contributed the most toward people having the highest lifetime incomes, is education, for one. And so we do have education to try to help people in the inner cities and such. But the other one is getting married and staying married to the same person.
Yes.
Which again gets into the family issue that we're just talking about here. Families are crucial to maintaining people's economic prosperity. And having a family unit promotes that. But trying to tear down the family unit is simply going to atomize society and create even more poverty and more problems, because what's going to happen when you don't have a place to live? Well, if you have a strong family structure, you can go live with your parents, you can go live with your brother, you can go live with your sister and such. And again, that doesn't always work. I understand that. Families are not always living in love and harmony either. But there's something to fall back on. But in our society, the government is being given all of these tasks, and the government can't really handle all of these tasks. And it becomes immensely expensive to do these things. I mean, if my son loses his job and needs a place to live, he can come live with me. But if the government has to fund it, the government's going to have to spend a lot more money to fund an apartment for him and other kinds of things like that. So the government simply can't handle these functions in the same way that a family can. And the family can do it in a loving way too, and can give the person emotional support that the government can't do either. The government just doles out money. They can't give the kind of love and compassion and emotional support and helping you to try to find a job. And well, yeah, they can do that to some degree. But again, there's things that the family unit can do that the government can't do.
Now, right now in America, there's movements such as Black Lives Matter, which explicitly says that they oppose the family unit, and they oppose, the cisgendered white male oppressive system, and they want to break down the traditional family unit and see more like villages of communities where everyone's taking care of everyone. And you touched on this in your article on Marx and Engels and the abolition of family. And when I read what you wrote here, it sounds like that's exactly what Marx and Engels wanted, and exactly what was being implemented in the Soviet Union, which was, we are going to create this utopia of everyone's your comrade. Everyone, it's like, Brave New World, but in 2020, not 600 years from now, right? It's this, everyone owns everyone. We're all just one big happy conglomerate. But what baffles me so much is that we have studies, just like you mentioned, that if you want to escape poverty, it's income. Don't have babies until you're married, and don't get married until you're after 21, or wait until you're 21 to have children. If you do those three things and you have that family, you are going to escape the grips of poverty by astounding numbers. So why is it that we're still still chewing on these bad ideas that it doesn't take a microscope to look through history and see the results of these ideologies.
Yeah, since the 1960s, we've been seeing the negative impacts of a lot of the sexual revolution that has come about, which was undermining the family by promoting free sex and sex outside of marriage, all sorts of family structures and such, easy divorce and other kinds of things. We've been seeing the effects of those, and they're negative effects to a large degree. But I find it surprising that instead of deciding that we've gone down the wrong path, at least those on the progressive side of the political spectrum are just sort of doubling down and thinking we need to go even further down that path and destroy the family even more. And now we're at a position where in the United States, less than half of the children are actually being raised by their biological parents. So in many respects, we have undermined the family and destroyed the family structure. We haven't completely undermined it and destroyed it. There still are vestiges of it, and there still are many people who are living in their family units. But there has been a huge amount of destruction, and we're living with the emotional problems that these children are carrying with them to school, just the problems that then they're going to come on the heels of that, of alcohol and drug dependency and other things, and suicide rates and other kinds of things going up. And yet, again, we're sort of, as a nation, we're just sort of doubling down on let's do it even more, instead of recognizing that we've created some huge problems that we need to turn back and go back to some of the old ways.
But it would seem that, and you write about this in your book, The Death of Humanity and the Case for Life. You write about how when we lose God, and when we lose God, we lose morality, and when we lose morality, we lose any sense of grounding or meaning or what is moral or immoral, because we're just a clump of random occurrences from billions of years, and we just accidentally came to be. And you write about that it's not just Marx and Engels that wanted to see these village-like families, but people have suggested in recent history that we shouldn't love our kids, we shouldn't kiss them, we shouldn't hold them, that if in a utopian society, kids would be passed around every 4 weeks to a new mom and a new family, and kids would be taken away from their families and educated by the states. It seems like it's not just that they're doubling down on a bad idea, but it's that they like this bad idea, that there's people out there that are saying, no, this is actually the world that we want to live in.
Yeah, and I'm in my book, Death of Humanity, I try to point out the inconsistencies within many of these people too, because you're right. Many of them are actually denying that there even is any such thing as love. They see love itself as being simply a epiphenomenon of evolutionary processes that have produced cooperation, and they try to explain this in a materialistic fashion and such. And so they dispense with the whole idea of love at all. In fact, Sigmund Freud in the early 20th century, of course, one of the most famous psychologists, said that love your neighbor as yourself was really a bad idea, and so he actually very forthrightly confronted and challenged the idea of love. Man. Friedrich Nietzsche quite obviously did that. Friedrich Nietzsche claimed that compassion was a bad thing, that we shouldn't have love and compassion for those that are needy and poor and sick. Rather, we should try to dominate and oppress and crush, other people. So, but on the other hand, there's a lot of progressives today that recognize that's not right. There's a lot of progressives today that the reason they hold the progressive views is because they do have some sense in which human life has value.
Well, and that's what's confusing. It's, to paint with a very broad brush, they would say that the right is more hierarchical and and more caring about the individual, and doesn't really regard those who are at a disadvantage, where they basically paint the left as or the progressives as people who are more compassionate and caring about the dispossessed and the needy, and those who are stacking up at the bottom of society. Yet at the same time, by and large, and this could be a very gross generalization, it seems like those that are on the progressive left are also those who are denying any sort of truth. I mean, the UN stated about in this article about social justice that anyone who believes in absolute truth and justice are not a good comrade and not good proponents of social justice, and we shouldn't seek their support in social justice. So it seems to me that those who are really strong opponents or proponents of social justice, at the same time, they're saying truth is completely subjective. And the issue that I have is if truth is subjective, then where do we have our moral grounding? Where do we have our moral underpinning?
Very question. And of course, the word justice itself, as you're suggesting in this phrase social justice, then really becomes meaningless. It becomes nonsensical. In fact, even talk about social justice if you're on the same, if at the same time you're using the term, you're on the other hand saying, there is no such thing as, moral truth and such. So they're trying to sort of have their cake and eat it too. They're trying to say that we should be pushing for social justice, but then there really isn't such a thing as social justice. That thing really doesn't exist. And so one thing I've tried to look at is trying to show that many of these people do have moral standards, moral things that they don't think are really negotiable. Now, sometimes if you try to press them, sometimes they will try to say, I have a colleague who I've talked about some issues like, for example, racism with, and I've sort of pressed him and said, well, isn't racism objectively wrong? And his response was, no, it's not objectively wrong. But yet he still wants to fight racism, and he's got this passion for fighting racism, but then it isn't objectively wrong.
But then if it's
you've got to decide, is racism objectively wrong or is it not? But
if it's not objectively wrong, then why should we care? If there is no objective right or wrong, if it's true what materialists say, that we are just determined by our social or our genetic makeup, and I can't control what I do, I don't have free will, then and there's no right or wrong, then why should we care? Why should we care about anything? Why don't we just go on and live the whatever way that we want to?
Yeah, and it seems that when I try to pose this to various people who are of that stripe, it seems like their basic response was that's just what I care about, and so I'm going to push it. So it just becomes, and this this is why a lot of intellectuals, especially those who are embracing the ideas of Michel Foucault, who's one of the most famous philosophers of the late 20th century, are very forthright about the idea that, whatever I believe, I'm going to push for, and I don't have to have a reason to believe it because there is no reason. There's no reason for it. There is no objective truth anyway, but I'm going to push for it because it's what I believe in. So it's all about power. And they will admit that. They'll admit that this is all about power. It has nothing to do with truth. It has nothing, according to them, that's not my view now, this is according to them, they would say it has nothing to do with truth. It has nothing to do with objective knowledge of any sort. It's just that I believe it, and so I'm going to push for it.
So now you've hit on Darwin, you've hit on Marx, Engels, we've hit on Foucault, you've hit on Nietzsche. So where do these ideas spring from your opinion? Is it from Darwin's theories that then have extrapolated into postmodern deconstructionist ideologies? And I mean, didn't Foucault commit suicide? Was that his death?
In thinking about where these ideas came, Foucault did commit suicide. No, excuse me, Foucault did not commit suicide. He died of HIV.
Okay.
But he was very.
He frequently wrote about. I believe you mentioned in your book how he was.
He promoted suicide and talked about setting up suicide clinics, and he did attempt suicide as a young man on a couple of occasions, and thought about it, but he didn't actually. He actually died of HIV. Which he contracted because he didn't believe that HIV was an objective reality. Here's another interesting thing. Okay, here he claims that HIV. He thought that HIV was a plot by the government and by the status quo to try to suppress homosexuality and such, since he was a practicing homosexual, and so he didn't take it seriously because he thought it wasn't objectively true. And then, of course, he ends up dying of it, finding out that, yes, objective reality does come to roost. Objective reality has impacts. Getting to your earlier question, though, about where this all comes from, I don't think we can trace it to any one particular person or individual. In my book, Death of Humanity, I go back to the Enlightenment period, although you could probably go back a little bit earlier, too, with a few thinkers. But the Enlightenment, I think, is when these ideas started to become pretty fashionable among intellectuals. That is, the ideas that things are determined by either your environment or by your biology, that there's no free will, and again, this wasn't even it was not even in the Enlightenment a mainstream idea. It was what's called the Radical Enlightenment. But there were enough people pushing these ideas, and many of them were materialists, people that rejected the idea that there's any kind of God, rejected the idea that there's any kind of spiritual realities and such. And so we just all became a machine. There was a famous book, in fact, that was written in 1747 by Julien de la Mettrie, a prominent materialist during the Enlightenment period. His book was called Man the Machine. So just defines humans as just being a machine.
So from this, the fruit of this, I mean, if you're looking at Foucault, if you're looking at what we're seeing today, I've been thinking about this and talking about this for a few years now, which is starting with the premise that we actually have agency. And I kind of walked backwards into this. My background is not in philosophy by any stretch of the imagination. I kind of walked backwards into this, even when I was starting this podcast. It was based in this idea that we have agency to own the future. We have agency to make decisions for our life, and that fatalism, or that the belief that we do not have any sort of free will, that whether it is that God is completely controlling us, or from the ideas of materialism, that we are nothing but neurons firing and we can't control ourselves, that these are the ideologies that are leading people, that are leading the youth of today. And it's across the globe. I have so many conversations with Westernized Arabs, or Arabs who have had a great inundation of Western culture or Western education. And when I have these conversations with them, I'm shocked at the level of secular humanistic belief systems and ideologies that are actually underneath the current, even though they might claim something on the outside. They might claim that they're Muslim on the outside. Everything that they talk about, it really seems to harken back to everything that we're talking about across the globe today, as far as secular humanism goes, and determinism, and this idea of fatalism. And then at the same time, I see this great movement of nihilism and existentialism, depression, anxiety, and I couldn't help but think, like, there's something going on here. And then as I've been reading your work and other works, seeing that really it is the denial of free will that has led to so many of these destructive ideologies. This denial of free will, meaning that life is meaningless, has led us to this place of life having no meaning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, precisely. Once you deny that there is any, any mind in the universe, that things are just come about by materialistic processes, chance processes, then really, yeah, you are left with no kind of meaning or purpose. In fact, here's an interesting example of this that seems really bizarre to me. I was at a Holocaust conference once, since I've done a lot of work about Hitler and the Nazi era and such. And the keynote speaker, who was a pretty well-known Holocaust historian, was giving this talk, and he started talking about how the universe is 15 billion years old, and he went through this evolutionary story about how humans arrived, and and basically he was talking about it happening all by chance processes and things like that, and I couldn't figure out where he was going with this, and this is a Holocaust conference after all. So, but anyway, he finally gets to talking how this connects to the Holocaust, and he said, the end of that didn't last a long time. It was just a very short thing, but he said, millions of years, millions or billions of years from now, life is going to be extinct and such. And he said, our task is to make sure that life goes extinct later rather than earlier. And I thought, well, given what you just shared with us about the meaninglessness and purposelessness of the universe, what difference would it make if Hitler slaughtered 6 million Jews, or if he slaughtered the entire human race? If there's no meaning and purpose in the universe, then there's no meaning or purpose in life or death.
And so why, where do these, I think we've kind of hit on it a little bit, but with these ideas, it's not just meaninglessness that comes forth. It's not just this nihilism, but really what comes forth and what you lay out in your book, The Death of Humanity, is it's from this idea of Darwin and evolution, or from the idea of materialism, as you've put it. It's not just one person that has developed this ideology. But from that, we get, well, the individual doesn't matter. From that, we should have assisted suicides. From that, we get, well, it's actually quite noble for you to kill yourself. From that, we get, it's immoral not to abort babies with Down syndrome. From that, we get, well, we should have, post-birth abortion legal up to, however many days. From that, we get these obscure metrics of how we should measure whether a person is a person or not. And how do we combat that? I mean, it's not, these are very small ideas that seem to spiral into crazy sorts of conclusions. What is it that we can combat that with in this modern day and age?
Well, I think you're right that once you decide that life has no meaning or purpose and such, and that's your philosophy, that it does, then even though you may not live completely consistently to that, and again, I try to show that, there are impacts that it has on the way that we think and operate and deal with human life and the value of human life. So, and then it becomes, in my view, completely arbitrary as to where you draw the line. That who is in the in group of humans that are deserving of protection, and who's in the out group of other, perhaps even Homo sapiens that are not in the group that protects. And again, it becomes very arbitrary. So you get these people that are fighting racism. Why is racism a bad thing? Because it's creating in groups and out groups within the human species based on arbitrary lines, and because everyone's life should have value, and many of the progressives understand that, but then they draw their own lines in different places. So a baby before it's born doesn't have any value, many of them would say. And even after it's born now, after birth abortion is becoming a big thing in some circles and such. And so it becomes just arbitrary where you draw the line. So in my view, I think we need to get back to a view where all human lives have value, and where we understand that life does have meaning and purpose. And that meaning and purpose isn't just built upon whether or not that person has particular characteristics of, let's say, rationality or ability to plan the future or things like that, that some bioethicists are now saying that that's what makes a human being a person. There's a so-called personhood theory, which is the idea that there's a difference between a human being and a person. And they would say persons are the ones that have value. Just being a human being doesn't give you value. And so my view is we need to get back to where we believe in human equality, that humans are equal. So a person who's mentally disabled is just as valuable a life as myself or any other human being.
And how, going back to the people wanting to destroy the family unit, it seems like there, time and time again throughout history, people are working to destroy the family unit. And I can understand from, maybe a Christian Judeo worldview of why the family unit is important. But what I think maybe I don't understand is why do these movements see the family unit or see a mom and a dad as such a threat to society?
Well, I think that's a very complex question, and I'm not sure there's any easy answer to that. A couple of things that I think, and again, I can't necessarily prove this, but I think in part it might be because in rebelling against God, as being God is a father figure in a sense, and so in rebelling against God, they want to rebel against those authority structures that they see mirror his authority or are reminiscent of his authority. And so they see any kind of authority as being a bad thing. And so the family structure does have authority in it. So that's one kind of explanation. I'm not sure that's a full explanation of it, but I think that's one way of thinking about it, about why they're wanting it. But I think the other thing I think you pointed out earlier too is that the family structure does support elements of the status quo, the economic structure of society, and other kinds of things, sort of a bedrock of society. And so, if you're wanting to completely overturn all the values of society, you need to try to get rid of the parental influences on children. In fact, that's actually a very key point that many secular thinkers from the Enlightenment on have made themselves. So, I mean, that's I think, a pretty solid point that they don't want parents influencing their children.
So why?
Because parents are going to carry on a lot of the same values that they have, and they're wanting to undermine those parents' values because they want a more radical position to hold sway. So they want control of children. That's part of the issue. And
I'm still baffled. Like it's just that they want control. You're saying that.
Let me give an example of this. Let me give a key example of this. Robert Owens, who was one of the leading socialists in the early 19th century, pre-Marxian socialist. He was from England. He was a factory owner himself. He tried to set up some utopian communities. One of them was in Indiana called New Harmony. It actually broke apart because they didn't have enough harmony there in New Harmony. But in any case, Owens said there were three main evils in society: God and religion. That's one. Two, private property. He was a socialist. And thirdly, the family. And he very forthrightly argued in his books that children needed to be taken away from their parents because parents were pernicious influences on their children, by teaching them religion, by teaching them, the values of private property and things like that. And so he very forthrightly promoted the idea that children should be taken away from their parents because their parents were bad influences on them.
But so in some ways it's like, well, that sounds so outlandish, but there's been the Harvard Symposium that states that parents should not be able to homeschool their children. Right now, we're looking at this Marxist, neo-Marxist, cultural Marxist movement in America that is saying that the communist or the capitalist system is corrupt and evil, that there shouldn't be private land ownership, that kids should be taken away from their parents. It seems like, in some ways, it seems like the atrocities of the 20th century are so far behind us. This idea that what happened with Mao, what happened with the Chinese Cultural Revolution, even what happened 200, 300 years ago with the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror, that those things are so ancient and so far away from us, and yet we're seeing the same language persist today. We're seeing the same movement persist today. Why don't we want to do away with these catastrophic ideas?
Yeah, many of the people that embrace, the progressive left have a false view of human nature. And I try to deal with this too in my book, The Death of Humanity, where I talk about some of these issues. But they basically see human nature as being good but corrupted by the systems. So the problem is all the system. The economic system, especially in many of the views on the left, but also political system and family structure and other kinds. So if you ask what produces all the ills of society, they see it as systematic, which is why you get all this talk too, by the way, today about things like systemic racism and things like that. The problem is all the system. The problem is not individuals. So individuals, they think, are basically good. And if you can just get them out of the system, then they'll do good things. They'll be cooperative. They'll help one another. They'll promote each other's interests. They'll be, loving and compassionate and kind and all these other kinds of things that they're hoping will take place. But of course, the irony is that when they start trying to undermine things like the family and private property and other things like that, where then does that authority reside once you take it away from the family and once you take it away from business owners and things like that? It resides in the government. Now, again, many of these leftists, especially on the far left, think wrongly that the government's ultimately going to vanish once you get rid of private property and the family and all these, that the government will vanish too, and you'll just have an anarchist society where everyone works in cooperation and harmony and love with one another. But the irony is that no, the government then becomes the authority and becomes the oppressor instead of the economic system. And when I talk with Marxists and anarchists and people who are on the far left, I admit there are injustices. There are problems with the capitalist system. It's not like it's a completely wonderful system. The reason it's not a completely wonderful system is because of people. Because there are people involved in it. There's one person who quipped, I forgot who said this, but one person said that democracy is the worst possible system imaginable, except for all the others. So the problem is that there are people involved in all of these systems, but they don't believe people are the problem. They believe the system is the problem.
That is all that we have for this first part of our conversation with Dr. Richard Weikart, who wrote the book, The Death of Humanity. Stay tuned for the second hour of our conversation, where we wrap this up specifically with how you can combat nihilistic ideologies in your life.